Hey guys, tonight we're going to drift back into the Middle Ages. We're going to settle into a world that looked very different from ours, where even the smallest little fib wasn't just considered bad manners, it was treated as dangerous. So dim the lights, get comfortable, let your shoulders sink into the pillow. Maybe you're already lying down, or maybe you've got a warm drink nearby. We're not in any hurry tonight. We'll just let this unfold slowly. Because tonight's topic might seem small, ordinary, almost boring. But in the medieval world, it carried enormous weight. We're talking about lying. Yes, the plain, everyday act of bending the truth. Something we do all the time, usually without thinking. No, I didn't eat the last cookie. Yes, of course I read the terms and conditions. Everyone knows the harmless fibs, the little white lies that grease the wheels of social life. But in medieval Europe, lying wasn't seen as harmless. It wasn't seen as a social lubricant. It was seen as corrosive, destructive, and, in some cases, catastrophic. And because medieval people had imaginations that were equal parts theatrical and paranoid, the punishments for lying could get very strange indeed. We're not talking about blood-soaked battlefields or shocking torture chambers tonight. That's too loud, too intense. Instead, imagine something slower, stranger. Punishments that were designed to humiliate, to sting, to burn themselves into memory. Because nothing said, "Don't do that again," quite like riding a donkey backwards through a crowded market while everyone laughed at you. But before we float into the punishments themselves, we need to pause. We need to understand why lying was treated so harshly in the first place. Because otherwise, it just sounds ridiculous, pulling someone's teeth out for telling a fib. The medieval obsession really was with truth, and more specifically with oaths. You see, an oath in that world wasn't just a promise, like, "I'll text you tomorrow," or "I'll meet you at the tavern at 6. An oath was sacred, a binding contract, not only between people, but between a person and God. When someone swore an oath, they didn't just say it casually. They swore it on something, maybe a relic, a cross, a Bible, sometimes even their very soul. Breaking that oath wasn't just disappointing a neighbor, it was seen as ripping a hole in the fabric of divine order. And medieval people were absolutely convinced that divine order was fragile. One broken oath could invite God's wrath not only on the liar, but on the entire community. So, you can see the logic. A lie wasn't just your problem, it was everyone's problem. It was cosmic, dangerous, contagious. And the punishments had to do two things. First, they had to restore the balance. They had to reassure God that dishonesty was being rooted out. And second, they had to send a very public, very loud message. Don't even think about lying. This is why so many punishments were theatrical. They weren't only about the liar, they were about the audience. Imagine a town square. The sun is high, chickens are scuttling around. Market stalls are packed with cloth, bread, salted fish. And right in the middle of it all, a man is perched awkwardly on a donkey. But he's not sitting normally. He's facing backwards, clutching the donkey's tail. Maybe he's wearing a cap with bells on it. Everyone is laughing, pointing, jeering. Children are shouting. The punishment is complete humiliation. That's one of the most famous punishments for lying, the backwards donkey ride. Symbolically neat. You twisted the truth, so now you yourself are twisted around. You went against the natural order, so now you sit against the natural order. It was cheap, it was memorable, and most importantly, it was public. Now, if the donkey wasn't available, there were plenty of other public humiliations. The pillory, for instance. You've seen them in films. Those heavy wooden frames with holes for the head and arms. A liar could be locked into one in the town square for hours. And here's the part that really mattered. The punishment didn't work unless the community participated. Passers-by were expected to jeer, to mock, and often to throw things. Rotten vegetables, mud, sometimes worse. And just so there was no confusion, a wooden sign might hang around the person's neck. Liar. This wasn't a short time out. Hours in the pillory could leave you sunburned, bruised, half frozen, and very sore. Because again, the punishment wasn't just the wooden frame. It was the spectacle, the audience, the shared memory that your dishonesty had been dragged into the light. Now, what if you were a repeat offender? Someone who couldn't stop themselves from bending the truth? That's when punishments got anatomical, because the tongue was considered the root of dishonesty. You lied with your tongue, so your tongue needed correction. Enter the hot iron. A liar might have their tongue pierced with a red-hot rod. Imagine the pain, the smoke, and the permanent scar. Every word after that would carry the memory of that burn. In harsher cases, the tongue might even be cut out. Brutal, yes, but in the medieval logic, effective. No tongue, no lies. Problem solved. And if the tongue seemed too extreme, there were alternatives. Teeth, for example. Some liars had teeth pulled out, not for dental reasons, but as punishment. Missing teeth became a permanent marker, a scar on the smile that told the world this person can't be trusted. Again, it was about visibility, turning dishonesty into something you could see, laugh at, or recoil from. It's strange, almost poetic. A lie is weightless, but punishment gave it shape. A liar became a walking lesson, and the rest of the community was the audience.
So we left off with donkey rides, pillories, hot irons, and missing teeth. Those were humiliations and mutilations, mostly aimed at men, because medieval justice was, like everything else in that period, deeply gendered. Women, of course, did lie. Shocking, I know. And the authorities came up with their own set of creative punishments. Ones that leaned less toward battlefield honor and more toward everyday domestic irritation. Let's float into that. Because if you thought riding backwards on a donkey was humiliating, just wait until you hear about the contraptions designed for women who talked too much, too sharply, or as the records usually put it, too naggingly. Which, in medieval vocabulary, often meant simply disagreeing with men. One of the most infamous punishments was the scold's bridle, also called the brank. Imagine an iron cage that fit over your head like a helmet, heavy, cold, and locked shut. But it didn't stop there. Inside, there was usually a flat iron plate, or spike, that pressed against the tongue. So if the wearer tried to talk, or lie, or nag, or just complain about dinner, they'd cut their tongue, or press it painfully against the metal. The symbolism was crystal clear. You lied with your tongue, so now your tongue was restrained. Problem solved, in the clumsiest, cruelest way possible. Women locked in the scold's bridle weren't tucked away in private either. That would have defeated the whole point. No, they were paraded through town, dragged along by a chain, while everyone laughed. The contraption made them drool, made speech impossible, and turned them into a literal spectacle. Imagine an iron bird cage, except you're the bird, and instead of singing, you're trying not to slice your tongue open.
Another classic punishment for women accused of lying was the ducking stool. This one sounds almost playful at first, like some sort of medieval carnival ride. But in practice, it was humiliating and often dangerous. The accused woman would be strapped into a chair attached to a long wooden beam, wheeled out over a pond or river, and then dunked into the water repeatedly. Up she went, down she went, sputtering, gasping, soaked, freezing, while the crowd jeered. Now, the ducking stool had layers of symbolism. Water was considered purifying. Lies could be washed away. But the real point was humiliation. A liar reduced to a dripping, shivering mess on full display. And just in case you're wondering, yes, drowning was always a risk. Because medieval justice wasn't about careful safety protocols. If you happened to swallow too much water, oops. The ducking stool was sometimes used interchangeably with the ordeal by water, which we touched on earlier. Float and you were guilty. Sink and you were innocent. So you can see the blurred lines between punishment, entertainment, and what they called God's judgment. Now, let's pause here for a second, because when you hear about these punishments, especially the ones aimed at women, you can't miss the social undercurrent. It wasn't really just about lying. It was about control, about silencing, about making sure that voices, especially inconvenient female voices, were cut short or publicly shamed. Lies, in that sense, were just one convenient excuse. But women weren't the only ones who got theatrical punishments that played on symbolism. There were plenty of community-wide rituals for liars, men and women alike. In some towns, liars had to wear special clothing, a cloak covered in bright colors or absurd designs, sometimes even animal skins, to suggest they were no better than beasts. Imagine being forced to wander around in a donkey-hide coat with ears flopping on top, while everyone pointed and laughed. Subtlety was not the medieval strong suit. There were also masks, not the fun masquerade kind. These were heavy iron masks, grotesquely shaped, often with exaggerated noses or long tongues. If you lied, you might be forced to wear a mask that turned your supposed sin into caricature. A liar's tongue became a ridiculous protrusion of metal wagging in front of your face. It was satire turned into punishment. Other times, liars had to literally carry their shame. Not just stones, like we mentioned earlier, but entire wooden signs or effigies. One record describes a liar paraded through town holding a large wooden tongue painted red. The message was crystal clear. This is what got you in trouble, and now everyone can see it. And then there was music, or rather, forced music. In certain German towns, liars were made to stand in public while musicians played mocking tunes around them. Everyone laughed, everyone sang. It was like being the unwilling star of a roast, except the whole point was to cement your humiliation in memory. But not all punishments involved elaborate props. Some were brutally simple. Take whipping, for instance. A liar might be whipped through the streets, each strike accompanied by an announcement of their crime. This man lied about his debts. This woman lied about her neighbor. Pain, yes, but again, spectacle first. The punishment wasn't private. It was designed to ripple outward, to remind everyone else what could happen. And of course, we can't forget the fines. Because while humiliation was popular, money talked. A liar could be forced to pay fines to the church, to the local lord, or to the injured party. Sometimes the fine was symbolic, a single coin. Sometimes it was crushing. Either way, it marked dishonesty with economic pain, and conveniently, it lined the pockets of those in charge. Now let's zoom out for a moment. Because lying in the medieval world wasn't just about gossip or petty theft. It was woven into politics, into law, into dynastic squabbles. A noble caught lying could cause genuine chaos. Oaths of fealty, land claims,
inheritance disputes, all of these hinged on truth. And if lies crept in, the consequences could be catastrophic. Which is why the higher up you were, the harsher the punishment could be. A peasant might get dunked in the river. A baron might find himself exiled, stripped of land, or even executed for perjury. It wasn't consistent. Justice rarely was. But the principle was the same. Lies could not be ignored. And yet, for all the harshness, there was a strangely theatrical poetry to it all. Lies were invisible. Punishments made them visible. A scarred tongue, a missing tooth, an iron cage on your head, a dunking in the village pond. Each turned dishonesty into something physical, tangible, unforgettable. It's worth remembering, too, that medieval punishments were often collective rituals. They weren't designed to reform the liar so much as to reassure the community, to prove in public that order was being maintained. If someone lied, everyone got a front row seat to the consequences. And in a world already teetering with famine, plague, and war, that reassurance mattered. A lie wasn't just a private slip. It was a potential crack in the fragile cosmic order. And cracks, in the medieval imagination, could quickly widen into disasters. So the punishments had to be memorable. They had to be theatrical. They had to turn dishonesty into a visible lesson. So let's float back, then, to that image of the donkey, because it's such a perfect snapshot of the medieval mindset. One man riding backwards, clutching the tail, the crowd jeering, the laughter ringing out across the square. Everyone remembers it. Everyone takes the lesson home. And the same with the woman in the scold's bridle, drooling and silent, dragged along the street. Or the soaked figure hauled up from the ducking stool, gasping for air. Or the pilgrim trudging endlessly toward a holy shrine, carrying shame on blistered feet. Each turned a lie into a story. And in the Middle Ages, stories mattered. They were the glue of community memory. So while the punishments might look absurd, even barbaric to us today, they made perfect sense to medieval people. They fit the worldview. A lie could bring famine. A lie could anger God. A lie could unravel trust. So a lie had to be burned, beaten, drowned, or laughed out of existence. And that's why the punishments look the way they do. Half morality play, half circus act, with just enough pain to make sure you never forgot. Now this is where we'll pause for tonight. But don't drift off too quickly, because we're not done yet. There are more strange punishments to explore, more theatrical humiliations, more bizarre rituals, more ways the medieval imagination turned something as small as a fib into a spectacle of cosmic importance.
So far, we've already wandered through ducking stools, branks, donkey rides, and all the other little carnival-style humiliations that medieval towns love to use on liars. And yet, we're really only at the surface. Because lying in the medieval mind wasn't just a bad habit, it was almost a cosmic insult. It was one of those sins that seemed to ripple outward, touching not just the liar and the victim, but the whole community, and even heaven itself. That meant punishments didn't just stop at making you look foolish. They reached deeper. They went for your soul, your reputation, and sometimes your actual tongue. At the very heart of medieval life was the oath. You swore loyalty to your lord, truth in court, honesty in trade, and even fidelity in marriage by invoking God himself. Everyone believed that if you swore on relics, saints, or the Bible, you wouldn't dare lie, because God would immediately notice and strike you down. Which sounds like a good system until you realize people still lied all the time. And when they got caught, society reacted harshly. Breaking an oath was like breaking the glue that held their fragile world together. So perjurers were dealt with in ways designed to make everyone else think twice before following their example. One of the most terrifying punishments was excommunication. That might sound mild to us now, like getting blocked on the church's group chat, but in the Middle Ages it was basically a living death sentence. Excommunication meant you were cut off from the sacraments, shut out from salvation, and technically treated as someone already condemned to hell. People were not supposed to eat with you, trade with you, or even give you a decent burial. Imagine being a walking ghost, cursed by God, all because you fibbed under oath. It was social death mixed with spiritual damnation, and you can bet that made quite an impression. But it wasn't always invisible spiritual punishment. Sometimes liars were made into public theater. A favorite ritual was forcing oath breakers to do penance in public, often barefoot, wearing only a thin shift, with a rope tied around their neck as though they were already criminals awaiting hanging. They would be marched through towns or into cathedrals, heads bowed while people jeered and muttered. The idea was that lying offended God and man alike, and only a show of groveling repentance could even begin to set it right. And then there was the wonderfully grotesque little tradition of making liars eat their own words, not metaphorically, literally. Sometimes a false statement was written down, then burned into ash, and the ashes mixed into wine or water. The liar would be forced to drink it, swallowing their lie with their own mouth. There's something bizarrely satisfying about that image. You lied with your tongue, now your tongue has to consume the poison of your dishonesty. A neat, if slightly disgusting way of closing the circle. But of course, not every liar ended up with ash in their wine. Sometimes humiliation was enough. Towns loved to turn liars into a kind of joke for everyone to laugh at. They would be paraded on carts, dressed in ridiculous costumes, and wheeled through the square while neighbors shouted insults. Some were forced to wear fake donkey ears or drag a comically long wooden tongue strapped to their chest. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a viral meme, except instead of being roasted online, you were roasted in person by the entire town. Bells ringing, children pointing, everyone remembering the scene for years afterward. And sometimes the punishment came in the form of noise. Communities could organize what was called a charivari, a ritual of public mockery where neighbors would bang pots and pans outside the liar's house, sing taunting songs, and generally make it impossible to sleep. It was a punishment delivered not by judges, but by your fellow villagers, and it turned dishonesty into something the whole street could personally avenge. You couldn't escape it, because it followed you home and haunted your nights. Of course, lying didn't always stop at gossip. Sometimes it crept into more dangerous areas like treason or fraud. When lies crossed into politics or money, the punishments escalated sharply. Consider counterfeiters. Technically, they weren't lying with words, but by stamping false images of the king's face onto coins, they were lying to the entire economy. And the punishment? Often boiling alive. Yes, really. Dropped into vats of water, oil, or sometimes even molten lead. It was theatrical and symbolic. Your lie was forged in the fire, and now you'd be unmade in the pot. Medieval justice never missed an opportunity for a metaphor, even when it was horrifying. And nobility weren't exempt either. A knight or baron who swore loyalty and then betrayed his lord was not just a liar, but a traitor, and execution was the usual result. Hanging was especially popular for liars because the tongue, the organ of deceit, was strangled into silence. In some cases, tongues were cut out before death, so that the liar's final moment was literally tongueless silence. The symbolism was never subtle. Courtrooms were also obsessed with honesty, because evidence, in the modern sense, like fingerprints or DNA, didn't exist. Everything relied on oaths and witness testimony. If you lied under oath, the entire system collapsed. So medieval courts punished perjury with permanent marks. Some liars were branded on the cheek, an unmistakable scar that shouted their crime every time they entered a market or tavern. Others were fined so heavily they were ruined. In certain regions, a liar could be legally declared infamous, which didn't just mean people disliked you. It was a technical status, meaning you could never testify again, never swear an oath in court, and never be trusted in official matters. You became legally voiceless, which in a society built on oaths was almost as bad as death. Religion added another layer of severity. Monks who lied could be flogged within the cloister or forced to eat on the floor like dogs. Priests caught lying might be stripped of their robes in front of congregations, symbolically peeling away their holiness. And if someone dared lie about a miracle, perhaps claiming to have been cured by a saint's relic when they hadn't, the punishment could be severe. Fraudulent relic sellers were whipped, exiled, or sometimes even executed, because lying about God's power wasn't just dishonesty, it was heresy. And heresy was one of those words that often ended in flames. If there's a common thread running through all of this, it's the obsession with symbolism. Medieval punishments weren't random. They were designed to make the crime visible in the punishment itself. You lied with your tongue, so your tongue was pierced. You deceived with a coin, so you were boiled like false silver. You broke your oath to God, so you were cast out of His community like a lost soul. Even the donkey rides and ducking stools had meaning. Liars turned the world upside down, so they rode backward. Liars polluted society, so they were dunked in cleansing water. It was always a morality play, acted out on the body of the liar for the education of everyone else. And people remembered. Punishment wasn't only for the guilty, it was also for the audience. Neighbors watched, laughed, gossiped, and told the story again to their children. The liar became a character in the village folklore, a cautionary tale with a name and a face. The theater of punishment made dishonesty not just an individual failing, but a collective lesson. It's easy to roll our eyes now and think all this was excessive. After all, so many of these lies sound small to us. Rumors about affairs, fibs in court cases, a false oath in a land deal. Did that really justify masks of iron, cut tongues, or vats of boiling oil? But for medieval people, lies weren't small. They weren't private. They were cracks in the fragile structure of trust that held society together. A single lie could spark a feud between families, collapse a market, or ignite a war. So dishonesty was never treated lightly. It was seen as a contagion, and the cure had to be strong enough to terrify the next would-be liar into silence. And that's really the heart of it. The punishments weren't designed only to hurt the guilty. They were designed to stick in the mind of every witness. They were a reminder that your tongue, small as it was, could ruin everything. And if you let it wander too far, it could very well cost you your tongue, your face, your soul, or your life. So as the candles burn lower and the night drifts on, that's where we'll pause for now. We've seen lies punished by exile, humiliation, mutilation, and even boiling cauldrons. We've seen the way symbols mattered more than pain, how dishonesty became a kind of theater for the community to watch and remember. But there are still other corners left unexplored. We haven't yet touched on the folk traditions, the carnival rituals, and the curious ways that lies got tangled up with witchcraft accusations and superstition. That will be the ground we wander into next time, as we continue unraveling the strange punishments for lying in medieval Europe.